Hello, I'm Dylan Hurley, sitting here with Michael Fraizer, author of Images of America, Rhinebeck. So Michael, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
I've been in the Rhinebeck area since 1971. I came here originally to teach. Had been out in the Midwest in Chicago teaching before I came out here. And spent some 30-some years, a combination of teaching and working as a school administrator. Most of it in Rhinebeck, about 10 years of it down in Westchester County. I'm retired from that, so it was an opportunity to get back to something that I was very interested in as a teacher. I was only for a brief period of time a social studies teacher. I mostly taught English, but I enjoyed teaching history, and once I was retired, it was an opportunity to get into it.
So when did you start writing?
When did I start writing this particular book?
Writing in general.
Writing in general. Well, as a teacher of English, you spend a lot of time teaching your students how to write. This is my first book, so I had never really written anything. I had written a master's thesis on the medieval literature, on symbolism in the Romance of the Rose. Not a very popular work. No, this is really my first work.
So, would you consider doing another book in another town?
I think it's a little early to think about that. I just finished this one, so I haven't really given it any thought.
How long did it take to write the book?
It took me, from the time the publishing company got in touch with me until now, is about a year and a half. Actually, most of the work was done back in January, so it was really about a year.
Can you tell us a little bit more about Rhinebeck, the town that we live in, that we and the viewers might not know about?
I find it a very interesting town, one whose history goes back a long ways. Even though you see the signs telling you when you enter the community that it goes back to the 17th century, what does that really mean? I mean, the significance is that in the state of New York, you really had, at that time, in the late 1600s, you had New York City, you had Fort Orange, which later became Albany. You did have some other communities like Kingston, that at the time was Esopus on the west side of the river. But the fact that there would be interest enough in developing a community on this side of the river that early tells you that it was a place of some importance. In fact, it was the reason the particular area that today is the hamlet of Rhinecliff was chosen as the earliest place for settlement in the community was due to the ideal location right along the river. You had a view there up the river and down the river that isn't matched anywhere else along the Hudson. And that was why three Dutchmen were eager to make a deal with three Native Americans for what turned out to be about 2,000 acres of property in 1686. And Rhinecliff developed before what Cynthia Phillip, the author of an earlier book about the community, refers to as the inland town, Rhinebeck. And yes, what we think of as the town of Rhinebeck, the village of Rhinebeck itself, actually is a latecomer. Even what we refer to as Rhinebeck really developed up north where 9 and 9G meet, and that was the original community of Rhinebeck, and later on it moved further south, where you see the development today.
So I've noticed the great quality of the photographs in the book. How did you obtain all the photographs? And were the families that were in the photographs, their descendants, were they helpful in helping you get them?
I had a lot of help from a lot of people. The two primary sources of the photographs were the Museum of Rhinebeck History and the Rhinebeck Historical Society. Both of those organizations have been collecting documents and photographs. The museum also collects artifacts for quite a few years, and those collections are very important, and I was able to share those. Those organizations allowed me to go through and use whatever I thought appropriate for the book. In addition, there were people in the community who were willing to share their material. One individual, for example, whose material is very important in the agriculture chapter in the book, is Catherine Goldsmith Hall, who was the treasurer and secretary of the Rhinebeck Grange. Actually still is, even though it has very few members today and doesn't play anywhere near the prominent role that it used to. But there were individuals such as the Mensch family that owns property where Grassmere is located. I have a photograph in the book from the late 1800s taken in front of Grassmere with a gentleman in top hat and tails, and he's not sitting in back of the coach, he's driving the coach, and he's got his golf clubs in the back. The very amusing but also historically important photograph, because it shows us an early view of what the front of that structure looked like. But there were other people like that who were just very generous and willing to allow me to use material that they own.
It's very great that the community was able to help you in this process of creating the book. Were there any photos that were lost to time that you could not find?
There are photographs that have glass plate negatives, for example, that we know existed that we don't have. There are other photographs which unfortunately were not preserved properly, that became moldy, that folks who had not stayed on top of what they had, those photographs that we know were important, have just, mold just destroys things and expands, and it's very difficult to control it. And I'm sure there are many other photographs that I never saw, that none of us is aware of, that have disappeared. And, I just deal with what I had. I mean, one interesting way that we became aware of some other glass plate negatives, we have a significant collection of 1890 glass plate negatives at the Historical Society. And we suspected that there were more in that collection from some lists that came with those negatives, but we never found them. And these negatives had originally come to us because somebody had found them in the rafters of a house on South Street. But as recently as about 6 months ago, I rarely go to auctions, but I went to an auction and thought I could get these two albums that were for sale for, I set myself a top price of $75. Well, the bidding started at about $300, and the two albums went for $600. And I mentioned to the person who was the successful bidder that should he ever decide to dispose of these, or this was a dealer, or be unable to sell them, the Rhinebeck Historical Society or the museum would love to have them. And we both chuckled, and I thought I'd never hear from him again. He did allow me to look through them, however, and I noticed that many of these were the same. These were black and white photographs, not glass plate negatives. That these were many of the same photographs that we had glass plate negatives of, but there were others in there that were the missing photographs. And I explained that to this gentleman, and he was interested in coming up and seeing the original glass plate negatives and seeing some of the other things that we had at the Historical Society. Wound up eventually doing that and allowing us in that process to scan the photos in his album. And we're in the process of, it's over 100 photographs. But it's in situations like that that you become aware of what you don't have.
Yeah.
That there are treasures out there that somebody owns, and they may not be anywhere near aware of what the value of those things are.
Now, were those photographs featured in this book, or are they on display at the Rhinebeck Museum?
There are a few of the images in the book are from glass plate negatives in that particular collection that I'm referring to.
Mm-hmm.
There are the majority of the majority of the photographs, as I said earlier, are from both the museum and from the Historical Society.
Could you tell us a little bit more about the Rhinebeck Museum and the Rhinebeck Historical Society?
Sure. The museum is located at Quitman House on Route 9, about a quarter mile north of the intersection of 9 and 9G, and is the museum collects photographs, documents, and artifacts, and has an exhibit once a year that runs the entire summer. We're open on Saturdays and Sundays from 2 to 4 between the months of May and the end of September. The exhibit that we have this year is on violets. And in fact, many of the items in the exhibit are the items that were used by Toby Carey, who's a filmmaker who just put together a DVD called Sweet Violets that actually, I believe he's shown up here in Red Hook a few times and showed it as part of the bicentennial event recently at Rokeby. But much of the material is what is on exhibit at the museum, and the museum has exhibits of many other topics. Our most recent exhibit before this one was on the Württemberg area of Rhinebeck, where the Württemberg Lutheran Church is located. We'll have our exhibit next year on textiles, showing different kinds of costumes that men and women wore in Rhinebeck over the years. But to answer your question about the two organizations, the other organization is the Rhinebeck Historical Society. It's an older organization. Our collection is located in the basement of the Star Library. We're open to the public, local history room there, on Tuesdays and Thursdays between 10 and 3. In fact, I just came over here a few moments ago from being over at the Star Library over in the local history room. The collection of the Rhinebeck Historical Society consists of documents and photographs, and if an item has some bearing on local history, we're interested in preserving it. And we've had many people here in the community who have come to us and given us their material that had been important to them over the years.
That's great. Speaking of violets, actually, I have a couple of questions about the book. You mentioned in the third chapter of Farming that violets and anemones were a symbol of Rhinebeck. Are they still a symbol of Rhinebeck today, if they were back then?
I don't know that they're as much a symbol today, but they were very important to the local economy from the 1890s to the 1920s, 1930s. During the economy, the contribution of violets to the local economy was so strong that it was the single largest source of tax revenue, not only to the town of Rhinebeck, but to Dutchess County. I think in 1905, it topped for the first time, the sales of violets topped $1 million. And in 1905 dollars, that was a lot more than what it is today.
Another question. Do any of the original setting families, wealthy or not, still live in the area? For example, the Kipps or the Crooks?
There are descendants of a good number of the original families still here in Rhinebeck. The Kipps, of course, Shrivers, Travers, Van Wagnens, Van Ettens. If you look at the list of the original Palatine families that settled Rhinebeck in the early 1700s, many of those same German names still appear here today.
So a lot of the settling inhabitants are still around?
Yes, yeah, many of the descendants of the original inhabitants. One of the interesting facts is that the Palatine Farmstead, which is located over on 9G, just north of the intersection of 9 and 9G, not far from Quitman House where the museum is located, was lived in by descendants of the same family through 8 generations from the original Locy, Elsifer families, Naher, right down through Catherine Locy, who was the last resident of that house, who passed away in 2000. And it was after she passed away that the Rhinebeck Equine that took possession of that property, bought the property, wound up donating 3 acres of it, including the house, to the Quitman Resource Center for preservation. So yes, that's just one example of a family that continued here in Rhinebeck from the original Palatine days. Franz Naher was a shoemaker, a cordwainer, and his family farmed that property, and his the 8th generation, Catherine Locy, was somebody who was well known in the area for her knowledge of the beef industry. She worked at a number of, they had their own herd right there at the property. She also worked at Ankeny Farm and was the person who was in charge of the beef competitions at the Dutchess County Fair every year. And when she passed away, the fair had a memorial to her, and there was an exhibit of all the things that she had done. She used to teach the children who were involved in 4-H at the fair. I guess some of them used to come to her place because she had cattle at that place, the Palatine Farmstead.
That's great to know that as a community and that as a town, we still are pushing forward in the future, but we have an eye on our past as well. Another question from the book. In the first chapter, Earliest Residents, you mentioned John Crook, and he was listed as one of the slave owners in the area in 1755. Do you know who the last slave owner was in the area?
I don't know who the last slave owner was. In New York, there were still a number you know that in 1799, New York State passed legislation for the gradual abolition of slavery, and in 1817, the state legislature further decided that slavery would be abolished in the state by 1827. There were still a number of slave owners in 1827. I don't recall the names, but the slaves they owned were freed at that point. There is one of the registers that's kept by our town historian, Nancy Kelly, is a register of children of slaves, because that law that passed in 1799 mandated that there be a record of all children born of slaves from that date forward. Even though I don't know the answer to your question regarding who the last slave owner was, it's very interesting that one of the first people in the area to free I don't know if there was more than one slave, was Frederick Quitman, Reverend Dr. Frederick Quitman, who lived at Quitman House. And he did so very early in the 1800s. And in the 1790 census, very few people realized that there had been a 1755 census in which John Crook, who you referred to, is listed as a slave owner. There was a later census, the first U.S. census in 1790, and in that census, the number of slaves in Rhinebeck was over 400. Yes, Rhinebeck was larger at the time. It included what is today Red Hook, and included a portion of the Livingston estate that today the county line was changed so that is now part of, so that's in Columbia County and not in Dutchess County. The point needs to be made, however, that the percentage of slaves as a percentage of the total population here in the town of Rhinebeck in 1790 was greater than in most states in the South. And very few people realize how important slavery, it was like that because slavery was critical to the economy of New York State. Somebody like Livingston owned the majority of these slaves and felt that he needed them in order to be able to maintain what needed to be done on his property. And you also had a situation in New York City where you had major dealers in the slave trade going back to well before 1790. And there were still those kinds of attitudes and economic pressures hanging on in New York State. On the other hand, you had the New York Manumission Society that was putting a lot of pressure on trying to change the laws and to make sure that slaves were free. And you had people like Frederick Quitman who were leaders in the community in trying to turn the attitude towards slavery into one that was more consistent with the fact that we had a nation that was a new nation at the time, committed to liberty and not slavery to the English. And the final irony here is that Frederick Quitman's house has a plaque in front of it that memorializes not the Reverend Dr. Frederick Quitman, but it memorializes his son, John Quitman, who left Rhinebeck, trained as a lawyer in Ohio, became governor of Mississippi, was a general in the Mexican War, and led an effort. He was very strongly pro-slavery, very supportive, obviously, in his position as governor of Mississippi and in maintaining the right of that state to continue slavery. and led an effort to take Cuba, use troops to seize Cuba so that Cuba could become a slave state. It didn't happen. He wound up having difficulties with his own legislature and died before the Civil War. Had he lived until the Civil War, it's very likely he would have been in the position that Jefferson Davis was. So it's you know, from in the history of slavery, Rhinebeck had both a hero in Reverend Dr. Frederick Whitman and somebody on the other side of the fence in his own son.
The Wilderstein estate was donated and is now is referred to as the Wilderstein Preservation. Were you able to tour all of the estates personally, and which one did you find the most appealing?
I've been able to tour portions of Wilderstein. Dwayne Watson has always been very generous, very eager to have that property open to the community. No, I did not. I wasn't able to. I mean, I have a number of the estates in my book. You know, I used to work on what was the Morton estate, Ellerslie. I was a teacher at Holy Cross campus, which became the Rhinecliff Union Free School District, and was superintendent of that school for many years, so I know that property pretty well. But the most of the other estates, I have photographs and I've walked around them. I've been on a couple, but most is only by reading about them and talking to people who've had connection with them.
You mentioned earlier that Red Hook was a part of Rhinebeck, but it split. Could you tell us more about that?
Red Hook is celebrating its bicentennial this year. When the New York existed as a colony and later became a state, the town of Rhinebeck consisted of what is today the town of Rhinebeck and what is today the town of Red Hook. But by 1812, for reasons that are not clear to me, but I would suspect because administratively it made more sense to maintain smaller areas for governmental purposes, the town of Rhinebeck basically was split in two. The population of Red Hook and Rhinebeck at that time was, as a result of the split, became fairly evenly divided, and as well as the amount of area. And it made more sense administratively. You had a pocket of population where the village of Red Hook is today, and you had a pocket of population where the village of Rhinebeck is. And rather than trying to, and this was not just in this part of the state, but there was creation of additional towns and reduction in the size of the number of square miles covered by individual towns throughout the state at that time. I mean, there was this dramatic increase in population throughout the Northeast as well. So it made more sense in order to be able to properly provide services to those communities to administer them in smaller units.
So, you know, while you're researching all that you can about Rhinebeck, is there anything that you found interesting or anything you learned that you didn't know or that normal citizens of Rhinebeck wouldn't know?
I learned a lot that I didn't know. Gosh, I don't know where to begin. I was fascinated by the amount of traffic that was taking place on the river in the actually from the 1700s right up until the early mid-20th century, the amount of traffic on the water was substantial. The number of ferries that went back and forth between Kingston and Rhinecliff was surprising to me. I thought that maybe 1 or 2 trips a day, but no, there was ferry crossings dozens of times every day, obviously during when the weather permitted. I was intrigued by the data on slavery that I was just sharing with you surprised me. I had always thought of this area as not being, that slavery was not a major factor in the history of a town in the state of New York. Not so. I learned a lot about different families. I never knew what the Grange was. I mentioned Catherine Goldsmith Hall to you earlier. She taught me a lot about the history of the Grange and what kinds of wonderful things they did for support that they gave to farmers. And while I probably would have disagreed vehemently with their politics, they were a very potent political power in this, not just in New York State, but nationally in the 1920s, 1930s. Interestingly enough, the person who was the head of the Dutchess County Grange and later of the New York State Grange was a farmer in Pine Plains who later became the head of the National Grange. Well, one of the other members of the Dutchess County Grange in the 1920s was Franklin Roosevelt. The National Grange, this fellow, the National Grange's political platform was vehemently anti-FDR, viewed his much of what he was doing as they called it socialist, and did everything they could to make sure that he wasn't going to run for another term. But what's fascinating is that FDR and this fellow from Pine Plains earlier on used to both be members of the Dutchess County Grange and would talk about issues related to the Grange in Dutchess County and got along pretty well, but not on the national level.
Throw politics into it. I hear you're having a meet and greet at Oblong Books in Rhinebeck. Can you tell us a little bit more about that event, in case our viewers are interested to drop by and meet you?
Sure. It's tonight, Thursday, July 19th at 7 o'clock. And I'm going to be talking about the book. I actually have a PowerPoint program that I'm going to share with everybody. And then I'll answer questions and sign books. The Hermans who own Oblong Books have not only been strong supporters of authors, but they are the family's direct descendants of Herman's family, and their roots go back in Rhinebeck many generations. Dick Hermans was a speaker at one of our Rhinebeck Historical Society programs, one of our programs last year, talking about his connection to local history. But yeah, at that program tonight, I'm hoping a lot of people buy books, and especially since the Hermans have decided that they will donate 20% of whatever they realize as income today from this event to the Museum of Rhinebeck History and to the Rhinebeck Historical Society. They don't have to do that, but it's very generous of them, and that's the kind of thing that they do, and we're very appreciative of that.
Awesome. I want to thank you for coming in to talk about your book today. This has been a Panda Studios interview. I'm Dylan Hurley, and this is author of Images of America, Rhinebeck, Michael Fraizer.
Thanks very much, Dylan.
Thank you.